When you look at a daily newspaper, or I guess today, when you scroll through a news feed, um, it usually just feels like this barrage of totally disconnected, chaotic events.
Well, absolutely. Just completely random.
Right, like a political scandal over here, a skirmish at a border over there, some stock market fluctuation, a factory strike. It's really just noise.
Yeah, it reads like a string of entirely random data points, that just happen to be occurring on the same day, on the same planet.
Exactly. But imagine handing that exact same newspaper to a forensic accountant who's like investigating a massive global syndicate. Suddenly, all that noise isn't noise anymore.
Right, it becomes a map.
Exactly. The factory strike isn't just some local dispute, it's a symptom of a supply chain collapse. The stock crash was a coordinated maneuver. The political scandal was, a deliberate distraction.
They don't just read the news. They read the underlying matrix behind the news.
Yeah, they see the architecture. And what's wild is in 1855, two radical thinkers who were living in exile used this exact forensic method to map out what they believed would be the eventual collapse of the entire global economic system.
It really is a methodology that completely redefines how we understand the relationship between just daily disposable journalism and grand historical theory.
Right. And so we are jumping into a very specific, incredibly dense historical window today. For you listening, whether you're a history buff, a student of political economy, or just insanely curious, our mission today is to extract the core insights from a very fascinating period.
A very productive period, yeah.
Right. Our focus is volume 14 of the Marx and Engels collected works. This covers a 14-month snapshot, specifically from February 9, 1855 to April 25, 1856.
A very specific 14 months.
Yeah, incredibly specific. And to reconstruct their operations, we're relying on the editorial prefaces, the publication histories, and the article indices from this volume.
Which give us a really clear picture of their day-to-day work.
They really do. Now, before we get into the actual mechanisms of their work, I do need to set a hard baseline for this deep dive.
Yeah, a necessary framework, given the subject matter, for sure.
Definitely. The source material we're discussing today contains foundational, politically charged communist texts. Our exploration is strictly an impartial, objective autopsy of the ideas as they are presented in the historical record.
We're just looking at what they wrote.
Right. Our goal is to understand what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were arguing at the time, not to endorse or take sides on their political worldview. We just want to see how they analyzed the geopolitical chessboard of the 1850s.
We are examining a specific method of critical analysis applied to one of the most volatile and, frankly, reactionary periods in modern European history.
And the premise here is just fascinating. You have these two underground radical thinkers driven out of mainland Europe, living in exile in England, and they're trying to survive during a period of intense, suffocating political reaction.
It was a very dark time for them, politically speaking.
Right. The authorities are hunting their allies, their revolutionary organizations are dismantled, and they are essentially broke. So how do they pay the rent while continuing to map the global economic system? They become incredibly prolific, highly observant freelance journalists. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, to really grasp the weight of this, we have to look at the atmosphere of 1855. Europe was basically locked down.
Like, completely.
Well, the great revolutions of 1848 and 1849, those uprisings that swept across France, Germany, Italy, and the Austrian Empire demanding democratic rights and worker protections, they had been utterly crushed.
Just totally wiped out.
Yeah. The old monarchies and reactionary forces had reorganized and consolidated their power. The counter-revolutionary order was not just established, it was paranoid and heavily armed.
So the window for any kind of, armed street-level revolution had just slammed shut.
Oh, it was bolted shut. Censorship across the continent was brutal. Radical political organizations, like the Communist League, had been driven completely underground.
And a lot of their leaders were locked up, right?
Exactly. Many were in prison following the Cologne Communist trial in 1852. Police spies were everywhere. Marx and Engels are living in England, effectively isolated from direct, kinetic political action.
But they still have this burning need to get their ideas out there.
Right. They have to disseminate their theoretical work to maintain intellectual links between the scattered remnants of the working class movement and, prepare the analytical ground for whatever revolutionary upsurge might happen next.
So their solution is to turn to the press. But they don't just retreat into some underground, mimeographed radical newsletter circulating among 50 people in a basement.
No, not at all.
They target the biggest, most mainstream publications of the era.
Yeah, they tapped into a massive international network of newspapers. Chief among them was the New York Daily Tribune.
Which was huge, right?
Oh, this was not a fringe publication. This was a colossal American bourgeois newspaper with a readership in the hundreds of thousands.
Wow.
And alongside the Tribune, they wrote for the German Democratic paper, the Neue Oder Zeitung, the Chartist weekly in England called the People's Paper, and periodicals run by David Urquhart.
Like the Free Press and the Sheffield Free Press.
Exactly.
Okay, I am struggling to connect the dots here, though. The New York Daily Tribune was a capitalist enterprise. It was a mainstream bourgeois paper.
Very much so.
Why on earth would the editors hire two known radical communists as their star European correspondents? And conversely, why would Marx and Engels even participate in that ecosystem?
Well, it was an incredible marriage of convenience, really, born out of necessity. In the 1850s, the mainstream American press was practically their only vehicle to bypass that suffocating European censorship we talked about.
Oh, so they couldn't publish in Europe, so they went to America.
Right, to reach a democratically inclined mass public,
Mm-hmm.
and the Tribune, which was managed by Horace Greeley and Charles Dana, was quite progressive for its time.
Progresses in what way?
Well, it fiercely condemned slavery, supported the abolitionist movement, and backed various social reform movements.
Mm-hmm.
The editors wanted high-level, sophisticated analysis of European affairs.
And Marx and Engels could definitely provide that.
Exactly. They were capable of delivering geopolitical reporting that was simply unmatched in its depth.
And the volume of their output in this period is just staggering. I mean, Volume 14 contains 135 separate works.
It's a massive amount of writing.
And the publication history shows that 76 of these articles are published in English for the very first time in this specific collection. That includes these really complex adaptations Marx made for the German Neue Oder Zeitung.
Right.
They were just churning out this high-level geopolitical and economic analysis week after week.
And you have to remember, the output reflects a grueling schedule. Marx was often battling severe poverty, creditor harassment, and recurring illnesses.
Yeah, I read that sometimes he couldn't even get out of bed.
Exactly. When Marx was too sick to write, Engels, who was working at his family's textile firm in Manchester, would literally write the articles for him.
Wait, Engels was working a day job and writing Marx's articles.
Yeah. He'd write them and send them down to London so Marx could submit them and get the paycheck from the Tribune. It was a highly coordinated survival strategy.
It's a bit like a modern underground hacker group funding their operations by writing, like, mainstream tech columns.
That's a pretty good way to look at it.
But, you know, survival strategies usually require compromise. If you're writing for a broad mainstream American audience, a bourgeois family newspaper, you can't exactly preach the violent overthrow of the ruling class on page 3.
No, you definitely cannot.
So doesn't writing for a broad mainstream audience force them to water down their revolutionary ideas?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the historical record suggests the exact opposite. They didn't water down their ideas, they just sublimated them into a different delivery mechanism.
How do you mean?
Well, rather than writing fiery, abstract, revolutionary manifestos, which frankly would have been spiked by the Tribune's editors or intercepted by European censors anyway, they used the medium of journalism to meticulously document the structural flaws of the capitalist system in real time.
Oh, I see. So it's kind of like an engineer stress testing a bridge. They aren't just writing a column saying, hey, a bolt fell off the bridge today, that's bad news.
Right.
They're using the daily news to calculate the tensile strength of the steel, the weight of the traffic, and the structural integrity of the concrete. They're effectively teaching their readers how to see the structural issues behind daily news.
That captures their methodology perfectly. They were training their readership to look past the surface of isolated events.
Like giving them a new lens to view the world.
Exactly. When Marx wrote a dispatch about a sudden financial panic or a spike in the interest rate at the Bank of England, he wasn't just reporting the numbers.
He was explaining the why.
Yes. He was breaking down the structural laws of capitalist overproduction. He was tracing the crisis back to the industrial system itself, demonstrating why the panic was a built-in feature of the economy, not just a random bug.
So they basically used the daily news as a Trojan horse for systemic structural critique.
That's exactly what it was.
This daily grind of journalism wasn't just a paycheck then. It wasn't a distraction from their larger theoretical work. It was the ultimate research laboratory.
Oh, completely. They were forced to engage with the absolute latest empirical data on global trade, military deployments, and parliamentary debates.
And let's look at how they split the workload, because the way they divided this labor is a really fascinating study in their partnership. How did this two-man research think tank actually operate?
Well, the division of labor played directly to their individual obsessions in their areas of deep expertise. Marx took on the role of the macroeconomist and the political analyst.
So he's doing the deep economic dives.
Yeah, he dove incredibly deep into political economy, the intricacies of foreign policy, and the daily theater of parliamentary diplomacy.
Like a piece from Parliament. Gladstone at the dispatch box.
Exactly. He was tracking British finances, fluctuating corn prices, complex trade returns, and the specific debates happening in the House of Commons, accumulating all these new facts and observations about domestic policies.
Which directly fed his sociological views.
Yes, precisely.
Leaving Engels to act as basically the military and linguistics geek. The volume highlights how Engels focused heavily on military science, the history of Slavonic peoples, and linguistics.
And Engels' engagement with military science was extraordinarily deep. He wasn't just providing superficial updates on who won or lost a battle.
He was really getting into the weeds.
He was analyzing the deep mechanics of warfare, the art of war. The source material notes that his regular reports on the Crimean War were actually so structurally sound that they were summarized into major theoretical works.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, he wrote an entire series called The Armies of Europe, which was published in the American journal Putnam's Monthly.
I want to dig into that because the level of detail in some of these articles, like the struggle in the Crimea and the war that looms on Europe, is intense.
It really is.
He was analyzing the organization, the specific tactical doctrines, the uniforms, and the supply logistics of the armies of Russia, Austria, Britain, France, and Turkey.
Right, dissecting their military potential based on their industrial base.
But here is my hang-up with this. You have this division of labor Marx doing macroeconomics, Engels doing military strategy.
Yeah.
But how did Engels' military analysis actually serve their larger political goals?
That's the key question.
Right. Like, why did a revolutionary care so much about troop movements?
Yeah.
What is the actual utility of spending your Tuesday afternoon analyzing the thread count of a Prussian military uniform or the specific turning radius of an Austrian artillery carriage?
Well, the utility is survival. Yeah, think back to the failed revolutions of 1848. They left a very bitter, enduring lesson. Willpower and revolutionary enthusiasm will always lose to organized artillery and superior logistics.
Okay, yeah, that makes a grim kind of sense.
Marx and Engels realized that you can have millions of angry, motivated workers ready to change the world, but if you do not understand the sheer kinetic capacity of the state's military apparatus, those workers will simply be slaughtered.
You have to know exactly what kind of machine is going to be sent to crush you.
Precisely. Military science became a practical life-or-death necessity for the working class. Engels was analyzing these imperial armies to map their structural weaknesses.
So he's looking for vulnerabilities.
Exactly. By looking at the logistics, he established the direct dependence of a country's military power on its socio-economic base.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. He pointed out the severe backwardness of the Russian army. They had massive numbers, sure, but they were reliant on a population of uneducated serfs and lacked the advanced industrial base to sustain prolonged, modernized warfare.
So they look strong on paper, but were structurally weak.
Right. And conversely, he exposed the sheer incompetence of the British aristocratic officer class. They had modern weapons, but terrible command structures.
So when Engels writes an article like The Struggle in the Crimea, he's ostensibly giving the American reader a thorough military update. But on a secondary level, he's mapping out the vulnerabilities of the global counter-revolutionary forces.
He's gathering intelligence.
Finding the chinks in the armor.
Exactly. And the biggest military case study they had, the massive geopolitical event unfolding right in front of them, was the climax of the Crimean War.
Right, and the Crimean War really is the backdrop for almost everything in this 14-month window. For context for you listening, this was essentially Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire fighting against the Russian Empire.
Primarily over influence of the declining Ottoman territories and control of the Black Sea.
Exactly. But Marx and Engels didn't view this conflict the way the mainstream press did. They didn't care about the territorial disputes of kings or, which emperor controlled which port.
No, they viewed international events strictly through the lens of Europe's revolutionary democratic development.
That was their ultimate metric for everything.
Yes. Their overriding task, the prerequisite for any successful proletarian movement, was the abolition of feudal vestiges across Europe, the unification of politically divided countries like Germany and Italy, and the liberation of oppressed nationalities.
And standing in the way of that objective were the major counter-revolutionary regimes. We're talking the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian monarchies, Bonapartist France, and the British oligarchy.
All of them had to be overthrown.
So they analyzed the war to uncover the inner workings, motives, and vulnerabilities of these specific empires.
Right. When they analyzed the Crimean War, they weren't picking a side to cheer for. They wanted to see these reactionary powers exhaust and weaken each other.
Hoping it would open a crack for a revolution.
Exactly.
It's a really stark contrast to how modern geopolitical conflicts are often analyzed today. We tend to look at wars merely as state versus state rivalries, like country A wants this resource, country B wants to protect this border.
It's often very two-dimensional in the mainstream press.
Yeah. But Marx and Engels analyze these conflicts as class versus class struggles masked by national flags. They saw international diplomacy as just a direct extension of domestic class preservation.
And you can see that in the collaborative piece they wrote, The Anglo-French War Against Russia. It's a prime example of this methodology.
How so?
Well, they meticulously track the shifting alliances and the diplomatic doublespeak, ultimately arguing that the Western powers, Britain and France, were actually conducting what they called a mock, or sham war.
Okay, calling the Crimean War a sham seems highly counterintuitive. I mean, hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. There were brutal sieges, disease, massive naval bombardments. How does a conflict with that much carnage qualify as a sham?
I know, it sounds contradictory. But the term sham referred to the stated objectives of the war, not the reality of the violence on the ground.
Okay. The PR versus the reality.
Right. Britain and France publicly claimed they were fighting a noble crusade to protect Turkey and defend European liberty against Russian despotism. But Marx and Engels argued that the Western powers had absolutely no intention of actually destroying the Russian Tsar or fundamentally weakening the Russian Empire.
Wait, why wouldn't they want to weaken their enemy?
Because the Tsar was immensely useful to them.
Useful how?
Tsarism was the ultimate bulwark, the massive police force of Europe, basically ready to crush any democratic or workers' revolution that might spring up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the rulers of Britain and France wanted to check Russia's expansion into the Near East to protect their own imperial trade routes, sure. But they needed the Tsar's regime to survive intact to maintain the conservative order of Europe.
So if the Russian Empire collapsed, the reactionary stability of the entire continent might just collapse with it.
Exactly, that was their fear.
That is a staggering level of geopolitical cynicism. They're basically arguing that the British and French elite were sending their own citizens to die in the mud of the Crimea just to slightly adjust the balance of power while actively protecting the very enemy they were supposedly fighting.
Out of a shared terror of their own working classes.
Yeah.
Yes. Marx explicitly laid this out. He noted that the British government would be just as ready to betray the Sultan of Turkey as they would the Tsar, if it served their economic class interests and prevented a democratic revolution.
So the whole war was just a horrific, bloody theater to calibrate the balance of power between oligarchs.
That's exactly how they saw it.
But it wasn't just the Russian Tsar they were gunning for. The sources make it clear that Marx and Engels directed a unique, almost searing level of analytical venom toward the regime right across the English Channel.
Well, absolutely. They had a special level of hatred for the Bonapartist Second Empire in France, led by Napoleon III.
Taking down the pretentious mediocrity of Bonapartism is a huge theme running throughout Volume 14.
It really is. They were relentless.
Marx was such a master of the political takedown. In their article, Criticism of the French Conduct of the War, they characterize the French regime as possessing a pretentious mediocrity.
A great phrase.
Right. And they argue that in the Second Empire, quote, semblance has taken the place of essence. They are basically calling the entire French imperial project a hollow facade.
And they expanded on this in numerous articles like Fate of the Great Adventurer and Napoleon's Last Dodge. The core of their argument was that the Bonapartist state's foreign policy, specifically its military adventurism in the Crimea, was directly connected to its domestic survival.
See, I hear that, but it sounds almost like a conspiracy theory. It's easy to call a leader you despise mediocre, but is it accurate to say an entire empire is just a facade built on military adventurism?
It's a fair question.
Like, can a state really survive simply by starting foreign conflicts to distract from domestic failures? Do we have proof that was a calculated structural move, or is Marx simply projecting his personal hatred of a leader he finds ideologically repulsive?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a pioneering analysis of a new form of state power. Marx and Engels weren't just insulting Napoleon III. They were identifying a structural feature of Bonapartism.
Okay, break that down for me. What is that structural feature?
They analyzed how Louis Napoleon came to power in the aftermath of 1848. The warring classes in France, the bourgeoisie who owned the capital, and the proletariat who worked the factories had essentially fought each other to a standstill.
Total deadlock.
Right. Because neither class could decisively secure political dominance, the state machinery itself, led by Louis Napoleon, stepped into the vacuum. The state elevated itself above society, appearing to be an independent, neutral arbiter.
So the government acts like the referee, but it's actually a rogue entity serving only its own preservation.
Yes, exactly. But because this Bonapartist regime lacks a stable, organic class base at home, it isn't truly rooted in the working class, nor is it fully trusted by the traditional aristocracy or the industrial bourgeoisie. It is inherently unstable.
It's floating in the middle.
Yes. So to maintain its grip on power, to justify the massive, bloated state bureaucracy, the secret police, and its plundering of the national treasury, it must continuously manufacture an illusion of national glory.
It requires constant conquest and aggression as the foundational principles of its political rule.
Precisely because it lacks that domestic base. Hence, semblance taking the place of essence.
Wow. So the military campaigns in the Crimea were designed to dazzle the French public, to project an image of imperial grandeur that masked the internal corruption and the sheer mediocrity of the administration.
And Marx and Engels pointed out that the domestic economic campaigns of the Second Empire were just as unsuccessful as their military ones.
Oh, really? Like what?
Napoleon III encouraged massive speculation, created institutions to funnel public money into risky ventures, and initiated massive public works projects, which provided temporary employment but were fundamentally built on unsustainable debt.
So the war was an absolute structural necessity. A regime built on a balancing act needs a constant state of emergency to keep the audience looking at the stage instead of the crumbling foundation.
That's a perfect analogy.
While France relied on military distraction, across the Channel, Britain relied on something else entirely to maintain its power: brutal, legally codified economic exploitation, which Marx was meticulously documenting.
Yes, during this period, Marx heavily scrutinized the domestic and foreign policy of the British bourgeois aristocratic oligarchy.
He was analyzing the global superpower of the 19th century from within its own capital. He wrote pieces like Lord Palmerston and Palmerston, the Army, taking dead aim at the hypocrisy of the ruling class.
He viewed the entire British parliamentary system as a sophisticated facade for oligarchic rule.
Right, but beyond the political takedowns, beyond the witty insults hurled at Palmerston in the press, Marx was engaged in something much quieter and, honestly, much more profound. The sources reveal that the daily information he gathered for his Neue oder Zeitung articles was actually the first draft of something massive.
Yes, he was secretly laying the empirical groundwork for his life work. He was doing hardcore economic research.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. The sources note that he was specifically using reports by factory inspectors and data on agrarian relations in Ireland, and this information was later incorporated directly into his magnum opus, Capital. He was reading what were called the Blue Books.
The Blue Books were these massive, incredibly detailed official reports compiled by British parliamentary committees and factory inspectors.
Men tasked by the government to investigate the conditions inside the rapidly expanding industrial mills?
Exactly.
You know, I just have to express awe at this workflow. He is a political exile, struggling to feed his family, writing these mainstream newspaper columns simply to earn a few pounds to buy bread. But the daily grind of meeting newspaper deadlines actually forced Marx to read raw government data.
The factory reports nobody else wanted to read.
Exactly. Reports detailing the exact working hours, the conditions of child labor, the sheer physical toll on the workers. And he is taking that raw data, that mundane bureaucratic tragedy, and synthesizing it.
Journalism wasn't a distraction from his grand historical theory. It was the data-gathering phase.
It really was.
The Blue Books allowed Marx to move beyond abstract philosophy. When he analyzed the reports of the factory inspectors, he wasn't just noting the misery of the workers, he was tracing the precise mathematical mechanism of that misery.
He was building the empirical foundation of one of the most influential economic texts in human history.
Right, and you really have to consider how much of our own daily news consumption could be synthesized into a larger understanding of the world, rather than just being viewed as isolated events. Marx used the daily news, the parliamentary reports, the trade returns. This was all raw material being fed into the theoretical engine.
It redefines media literacy. He consumed the news to build a predictive framework. And this incredible, grueling synthesis of daily journalism and grand historical theory culminated in a really powerful moment in the spring of 1856.
Yes, it did.
We can conclude this historical narrative with April 14th, 1856. Marx is invited to deliver a speech at a banquet in London.
This was a banquet honoring the 4th anniversary of the publication of the Chartist paper, the People's Paper.
And despite living through a period of intense political reaction where revolutions had recently failed, the speech is described in the sources as being, quote, full of revolutionary optimism.
Which is pretty remarkable given the circumstances.
It really is. He spoke of the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the world historic mission of the working class. And he ends the speech with this incredibly dramatic, forceful declaration. History is the judge, its executioner, the proletarian.
It's a very famous quote, and it really captures his mindset at the time.
But so, what does this all mean? How do we reconcile the meticulous, dry forensic accountant sitting quietly in a library reading factory inspector reports with this incredibly dramatic, almost prophetic rhetoric?
Well, this is the essence of Marx and Engels in 1855 and 1856. They were not just academic commentators.
Right.
They believed that their rigorous analysis of history, economics, and warfare objectively proved that the current system was deeply, fatally unstable.
The math backed up the prophecy.
Exactly. The meticulous research revealed the undeniable contradictions within capitalism. The rigorous research justified the dramatic optimism. They believed they were simply reading the inevitable trajectory of history hidden within the daily news.
It's a profound reminder of how deeply they believed that understanding the world was the first absolute step toward changing it.
You can't dismantle the machine until you know exactly how it works.
And Volume 14 shows us exactly how they drafted those blueprints. It really is an incredible, exhausting 14-month sprint we've covered today.
It really is.
We've traced how they turned daily journalism for global newspapers into a theoretical weapon, analyzed the Crimean War as a cynical chessboard of class preservation, exposed the mediocrity of Bonapartism, and gathered the raw data for capital.
They took the noise of the 19th century and found the signal.
Which brings us to a final thought to mull over. We live in an era of infinite information and 247 news cycles, which often leaves us feeling overwhelmed and paralyzed.
It's very easy to just tune it all out.
Yeah, completely. But if we look at how Marx and Engels treated the daily news in 1855, not as a flood of random events, but as puzzle pieces revealing the hidden structures of society, it raises a question. What patterns are we missing in our own daily news feeds simply because we aren't looking for the underlying architecture?
What structures are hiding in plain sight?
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you read every day.